Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Plains on the Prairie podcast. I'm Max.
And I'm Sam.
And today we are on episode 2 of our Minnesota Aces series. And this one is actually, I'd say, one of the more famous World War II aces that we're going to cover in the entire series.
Yeah, this one's going to be pretty exciting. And, the nice thing about Minnesota is a bigger population,
Absolutely.
So we have this is a huge series and we have so much diversity.
Right.
And this one, it's exciting.
Yeah. So in case you didn't read the title, we are covering Ken Dahlberg, a very famous World War II pilot, both obviously during the war and after the war.
Right.
And we'll briefly cover some of that in this episode, but we won't really focus on it. So without further ado, I say let's get started.
Yeah, so we'll jump right into his early life. So he was born June 30th, 1917, right in St. Paul, Minnesota, but then he grew up on a farm just across the border in Wilson, Wisconsin, which is kind of near Eau Claire, Menominee area.
Gotcha.
Moved back to St. Paul for his senior year and actually graduated from Harding High School in 1935. And then he got into the hotel business. He started working in the food side of the hotel, and then eventually started to manage and then actually moved to Indiana with another hotel.
Right, because he grew up on a farm.
Yeah,
right. And,
didn't want to go back.
Right, and I mean, in the 1930s, the Great Depression was in full swing. At least maybe not so much in 1935, but you can't blame a guy for not wanting to go back to that.
Typically hotels back then, that was kind of the hotels he worked at were more lavish, and the disparity between the classes was a lot bigger. So
Absolutely.
Can't blame him for going up.
No, absolutely not. So we'll get into his military service. So he was actually drafted into the U.S. Army before Pearl Harbor in 1941, and then was inducted into the U.S. Army on November 2nd, 1941. He was attached to the Coast Artillery of the 4th Battalion Battery B at Fort Eustis in Virginia. And while he was there, I think that's where he submitted his request to either transition to the Army would have been the Army Air Corps at that point?
Yep, the Air Corps.
Yep.
But yeah, he wasn't very satisfied with the artillery. He just wanted to do something different. That's kind of what I gathered out of it. And he ended up graduating pilot class training, or Class 42K, which is the 11th class of 1942.
Gotcha.
And on December 3rd, 1942, he's commissioned as second lieutenant.
Sweet. So after being commissioned, he was assigned as an instructor in T-6 Texans at Laguna Army Air Force Base at Yuma, Arizona, and then afterwards was sent to Luke Army Airfield, which is now Luke Air Force Base near Phoenix, Arizona, to, interestingly, teach a group of Chinese pilots to fly P-40s. I assume they were the nationalists.
Yes.
But, kind of that cool connection with, the Pacific Theater, which Dahlberg never flew in, but,
right.
He's still kind of connected to it, even if in the small sense like that. So he was then reassigned to the 553rd Fighter Squadron of the 354th Fighter Group in April 1944 as a replacement pilot. And he claimed his first victory just after D-Day on June 22nd, 1944, over Chartres. I'm terrible. Forgive me.
Pardon our French.
Yeah, pardon our French, literally, over France, and that was a Bf-109. His second victory came just a few days later on June 29th, 1944, and it was an FW-190, and he was flying the P-51B Beantown Banshee. Now, we'll talk about, obviously, more of the aircraft at the end of the podcast, like we normally do, but we were talking before the episode, and Dahlberg was kind of a journeyman when it came to what Mustangs he was flying.
Well, and these replacement pilots, such as Dahlberg, didn't get assigned an airplane because they were just junior.
Right,
right. So they were flying all over the place. It's just who is off, right?
Right.
Who can I take?
And it's, one of those things that, we live in such an era where when a military jet goes down, it's kind of big news. But in combat, especially in World War II, it's like, hey, Dahlberg crashed your plane, man. Sorry.
Well, and that's, if you remember back to Emerson, Donald Duck.
Yep.
The first one, it crashed before Emerson, got to fly it again.
And
so
I find it funny. It's like, back then you see like Shimmy 4 or Scrap Irons 5. It's like, man, how many planes did these guys go through?
Well, and we'll find out here that it's a good thing this guy didn't have his own planes.
Right. So yeah, and kind of interesting fact about his second victory, in an interview conducted many years after the war, Dahlberg claimed that this pilot that he encountered was the most formidable German pilot he encountered in the entire war. And if I remember reading the account of that shoot down correctly, they were over a small village in France, and they got into a turning fight, and Dahlberg just managed to get a few shots into the Germans' either fuselage or wing, and the plane went down. So there was no chance of survival, unfortunately. And then he claimed 3 more victories and actually became an ace on August 16th, 1944, while flying Shillelaugh, a very interesting P-51B Mustang. All BF-109s on that same mission. He encountered over 60 German fighters.
It was a big mess, yeah.
What? That is crazy.
Yeah, so he and a few others, they're very outnumbered, which is odd for this time of the war, with the air war kind of becoming one-sided with the, on the German side of things, the pilot quality dropped, training time dropped. So, yeah, he was shot down, actually, in this engagement. He already claimed two kills by the time he noticed a drop in oil pressure because he had a group of Germans behind him at one point. Ended up shooting another one just on his way down, and then he bailed out near Dreux, France. And a French woman and later her husband assisted Dahlberg in hiding from the Germans for a few days because the lines were shifting and they were pretty close. She actually hid in a small pond while Germans were searching the area because they saw the parachute, and they kind of played dumb. And then he dressed in civilian clothes and remained at the farm for a few days. And then a couple days later, ended up going back on a truck across the lines.
Wow. You hear stories about, evading and stuff like that, but it's this actual, what they did to evade the Germans. You always think of the Longest Day or the, what's the other iconic POW movie, The Great Escape.
Great Escape,
hiding in hay bales and stuff, but literally hiding underwater. That takes courage.
Yeah, well, we'll plug the book in a little bit, but in the book we used to research, they actually said they remained friends. So later on in the war, as the lines were shifting, they would go over to their house for dinner parties and things like that because they were pretty wealthy, this family.
Right.
But yeah, very interesting.
Interestingly, on September 12th, he almost became an ace in a day. He scored 4 victories, again, all against Focke-Wulf 190s. Very impressive. Just adding to the very impressive total that Dahlberg had during the war. The 354th Fighter Group began converting to P-47s in November of 1944, but that still hadn't gone into full effect for the 3 squadrons underneath the group. So he did shoot down an additional 2 more BF-109s on December 1st while still flying Mustangs. 18 days later, on December 19th, he shot down 3 BF-109s in P-47s. And it was this engagement that he was nominated for the Distinguished Service Cross. He wouldn't receive it, however, until 1967 because he was a POW.
Which we'll get into here soon. And actually, this there was 3 shot down, but then an additional 4th victory was credited to him in 2007 after a review board looked at the gun camera footage and just personal accounts and whatnot. So that actually bumped his official total up to 15. Some of the books and online sources say it's 14, but I'm guessing it's because the review board is in 2007, and a lot of the sources we use are pretty dated.
Right, absolutely.
So
on December 26th, the day after Christmas, he was shot down for the second time. He was hit by ground fire and crash landed just beyond enemy lines near Bastogne. Obviously, if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably well aware that there was some serious fighting going on around Bastogne and that surrounding area, especially just around Christmas. So where he went down was hot with contact. So
and the lines are just shifting all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. So interestingly, what I was able to find was he was flying an unnamed P-47 Thunderbolt. However, it did have the squadron code FTO on the side. So that means whatever number of O is in the alphabet. As an English major, I should probably know that.
Yeah.
But remember that. Remember FTO, because it comes into play later. So from what we read in the book, it was a very violent landing. He actually, I think, did it say he hit a tree?
Yeah, and he
really banged up his ribs.
Yeah.
Interestingly, however, an American tank crew, despite being, 2 miles behind German lines, an American tank crew, which was commanded, amazingly that they were able to have the name of the guy, the tank crew was commanded by a Sergeant Martin Dardis, saw the crash and commandeered a Jeep, and drove over to the wreck and found Ken sitting on the wing. And basically, we have to remember during the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans, during Operation Grief, I believe, were using American-born, American-speaking Germans to wreak havoc. So there was that, are
mistrust.
You really, tank commander? Are you really an American pilot? Obviously, if you're staying on the wreck of an American plane, you probably are. But, you can never be too sure. So he was rescued by the American tank crew and then returned to American lines. And then somehow, again, he scored 1.5 victories that day. But it wasn't until 2007 that the gun camera footage confirmed that. Is that correct?
This actually wasn't ever confirmed because the gun
okay.
camera footage was never recovered because of the plane crash behind enemy lines.
Gotcha.
And something to note about Dahlberg, opinions aside on however you view him politically, or some of you probably know him politically on the podcast, actually seemed pretty humble in a way. He didn't really care about the victories. He in the book it mentions, it wasn't a big deal. We're just doing our job.
Right.
And it goes to show some people probably would flock all over that gun camera footage on their way out.
So you got to wonder, what do they do with it?
Yeah.
With that wreck, if it was that mangled up, would they have just buried it where it landed, or
probably because it was still behind lines, so who knows?
Right.
But very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So just a couple months later, he was shot down for the third and final time on February 14th, 1945, near Metz, and I believe that is Germany, right?
Yeah, just across the Rhine.
Yep. So shot down over German territory, and from what we gathered in the book, he took a pretty serious cannon shot or artillery, whatever you want to call it, almost directly behind him, and it blew him out of the plane, and he was unconscious.
Yeah.
Like the book, or how he describes it in the book, is almost terrifying.
Yeah.
And I think he said that he doesn't know what made him wake up, if it was the cool or the very cold air blowing against his face or what. But I think he pulled the ripcord at about 500 feet and had obviously a very violent landing, and he wasn't captured right away, if I remember correctly.
He was hiding in trucks. He was hiding wherever. He lost his service pistol at some point.
He was crossing a river, and he lost his emergency pack. I think he kept his shoes, but he wasn't wearing them. Just a really nasty ordeal. Let me kind of backtrack here. The second time he was shot down, he was flying a P-47 with the squadron code FTO, and it was unnamed. Coincidentally, he was shot down for the third time flying the replacement P-47 that was also FTO. So, kind of unlucky.
Yeah.
If I was him and managed to escape, which he almost did, I think I would stay away from FTO.
Yeah.
the third one. We mentioned he was ejected from the plane. He was kind of hopping from, truck to car to hay bale. And when he was taken prisoner initially, I think it said that it was just one guy that was guarding him with his rifle. And the German soldier, probably just a conscript, not realizing that he was dealing with Ken Dahlberg, set his rifle down. And very fortunately, Ken could have probably done much worse to this guy, but all he did was whack him with the rifle. I don't think he took it. I think he just took off.
Took off, yeah.
And I think he was on the lam for at least maybe a couple hours. Was it a couple days?
Yeah, well, he actually just stole a car right then.
Yeah.
And then he stole a Citroen, I think.
It was he says it was marked up like a medic's vehicle or something like that.
So
it
he
was
was
a German
able
military car,
and he was able to kind of escape a little bit until he got to a checkpoint. Didn't want to stop at the checkpoint, so tried going through. Hit the wood barrier with the windshield.
Ooh.
So which put him into a ditch.
Right.
And Then he was recaptured. They knocked out his teeth
Yep.
for being for hitting the guy with the rifle. But
he did mention in the book that was the most, I think, damage isn't the right word, but that was the most punishment he received as a POW.
Yeah, and say what you will.
If you knock out your guard, they're gonna
the Germans were generally more friendly to the Western allies than other
especially
powers.
Officers.
Yes.
Yeah.
As long as you were of the right thing in the Germans' eyes. Yes. So, but aside from that.
So yeah, and he spent the remainder of the war in Stalag 7A in southern Germany until his liberation on April 29th, 1945 by the 14th Armored Division.
Quite a story.
Yeah.
3 times.
No kidding.
3 times shot down.
Once POW.
Only once as a
couldn't
POW.
hold him back.
Yeah.
Wow. Very incredible career.
Yeah.
So, post-war, Ken Dahlberg went on to join the Minnesota Air National Guard, flying F-51 Mustangs until 1951. Now, did we ever find out, was it Duluth or was it Minneapolis?
Couldn't find it.
My guess would probably be Minneapolis.
Yeah, just based off where he's from.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And then he went on to work for Telex and helped develop a new aviation headset, kind of that set the standard for what we really have today.
Yeah, because he was talking about the uncomfortable headsets from World War II.
Yeah.
I mean, we have a couple sets here at the museum that we're filming at, and yeah, they're not great compared to nowadays. I mean, people still complain about headsets being uncomfortable, but imagine back then.
Yeah,
we didn't have fancy noise
it's like
canceling.
Holding a literal tire to your head.
Yeah,
yeah.
And Telex also is famous for hearing aids as well, and they were around for quite a long time.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and then Dahlberg ended up having an idea, and the CEO of the company didn't like, or was afraid of Dahlberg, going off on his own and competing. So the CEO went up and fired him before, and Dahlberg didn't seem to have any intentions of that from the book, at least. And then Dahlberg went and was like, okay, I'll go use my GI money, back pay from actually when he's at POW, and started his own company. And he actually got a little money in the settlement for wrongful termination. And he started Dahlberg Electronics, which later turned into Miracle Ear, if you've heard of that. That's a pretty well-known hearing aid company. And,
really?
They're still around today under a slightly different name. They're still kind of known as Miracle Ear. Mm-hmm. And they're headquartered in the city still. And they have over 1,500 locations nationwide.
Wow.
So he started a very successful hearing aid business. And then in the 90s, he actually started from Arizona. I'm guessing it didn't say much, but he kind of retired in Arizona.
Right.
He actually started a venture capital firm called Carefree Capital, which is based in Carefree, Arizona, which included investments in many business, including one of the Plains on the Prairie headquarters, one of our idea spots, Buffalo Wild Wings.
It's a match made in heaven.
It's perfect.
You can't make that up. So we talked earlier at the beginning of the episode about Ken Dahlberg's very incredible life, both during World War II and after. Now, we're not a political podcast. We've said that before.
No affiliations.
We're
not paid by a PAC.
We're bipartisan here. But Dahlberg was involved in a very completely different historical event in the 1970s when he wrote a check for $25,000, which in turn linked the Watergate break-in to the committee to re-elect Richard Nixon. So he was not charged with any wrongdoing, but it's kind of funny if you listen to the full Watergate tapes that were released back in the 70s. Nixon is on air or caught on the phone, and he says, "quote, who the hell is Ken Dahlberg?" Yeah. So kind of, how many World War II pilots can you say, built such a career for themselves during the war, and then went on to be involved with something that has absolutely nothing to do with World War II itself, but is just an equally impressive, well, maybe not impressive is the right word, but, moment in American history.
Yeah. It's crazy.
Yeah. But again, he was never charged with any wrongdoing, and that was kind of the end of that whole political deal. I don't think he ever tried to run for
office or
anything like that.
I feel like he couldn't, even if he didn't do anything wrong,
Right,
in the public eye. It's still a sensitive subject, and
even today,
he wasn't well liked among some Republicans after that. So, and even though that was his official affiliation.
So on October 4th, 2011, Ken Dahlberg passed away at the very ripe old age of 94 and was buried in Arlington National Cemetery in Washington, D.C. So,
and he lived a full life. He was still flying up until the late 2000s.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
So he, had a Citation. He had a Bonanza at some point. He was flying a lot still in his civilian life.
Absolutely.
Which you don't see much out of these aces or World War II vets. They're not, we had quite a few here at the museum over the years, and not many of them actively flew as, licensed pilots.
But I like comparing it to Scrappy Bloomer.
Yeah.
The guy, he couldn't get enough of it. Like long after World War II ended, he went out of his way to buy a surplus P-38. Right. So how many pilots can you say, flew combat missions and on top of that shot down enemy fighters and went back to fly the same plane they flew? Yeah, exactly. That's always kind of impressed me about Scrappy. But, at the same time, it's like, can you imagine being able to buy a P-38 surplus today? Like, what would that be comparable to? Like buying an F-4?
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, a lot of money.
Absolutely. Well, now we're going to shift our focus to the history of the 353rd Fighter Squadron of the 354th Fighter Group, just keeping with how we normally format these podcasts. So the 354th Fighter Group was activated on November 15th, 1942 at Hamilton Army Airfield in California. And like a lot of those early Army Air Force squadrons, they were equipped with Bell P-39 Era Cobras. In 1943, they moved to RAF Boxted and were attached to the 9th Air Force and equipped with, I'd say new at the time, P-51B Mustangs. Mm-hmm. Did it say anything if they had the Malcolm hoods, or is that kind of just implied?
I believe they did have the Malcolm hoods, just from other research on other pilots of this group.
Gotcha.
But yeah, they, interestingly enough, though they were officially attached, or a part of the 9th Air Force, they're actually attached to the 8th Air Force.
Really?
To provide fighter escort. So that's spoiler. We do have another ace coming up from this unit, so learned a lot about that in researching that ace as well. But yeah, they were under the 9th by name only at that point, which was really interesting.
Yeah, so. I had never heard about that before, researching Ken, but it's one of those things that's just like, you would have to imagine how many fighter squadrons were busy with, air interdiction over occupied France and maybe even northern Germany. Yeah. But, they needed escort fighters. I mean, you think about how much of a fight those B-17s and B-24s were up against, and it's kind of, it does, at the end of the day, it's not very surprising.
No, and then, eventually, they ended up doing fighter sweeps along with that, through the Low Countries, and up until after D-Day, they were providing ground support. They, as you can see, just going off the timeline of Dahlberg, most of his victories, all of them pretty much came, all of his official ones, came, before Christmas, before the Battle of Bulge.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, eventually the unit did transition over to P-47s in November.
Mm-hmm. And that's kind of when the mission shifted from escort to
became a fighter bomber wing.
Exactly,
pretty much.
Attacking German troop concentrations, rail yards, trucks.
Yep, and it was a mixed emotions among pretty much all squadrons across the 8th and 9th. Mm-hmm. It was like, shoot, can't go find any fighters, but as some of even casual historians of World War II kind of know, the chances you met up with fighters in the air late 1944, early 45 was dropping.
Pretty slim.
Just because of the, not plane shortage, but pilot shortage in the Luftwaffe.
Yeah, and, I think, not to downplay Dahlberg's credits at all, but, you got to look, the pilots of late 1944 were not the same Luftwaffe pilots of, 1941. Like,
no.
Those guys in 41 had fought in the Spanish Civil War, or on the early days of the Eastern Front, and had invaluable combat experience. But by 1944, they probably were much older. They were younger than us.
You can say the same thing for the Germans, too, though, with with who they were fighting.
Right, very true.
Different unprepared nations, or lower quality fighters. I mean, you can say that for everybody. So it's interesting to see like who they went up against, and I think Dahlberg is impressive in his own way. Look at all the multi-kill days.
I know, yeah.
I mean,
especially
he had 2 days where
kill
only
day.
one.
Yeah.
So the rest of his came all in once. So it's very interesting.
Very impressive.
And that's showing, okay, numbers weren't on their side all the time.
Right.
So
especially, where he was outgunned and
and 43 and 44 were the biggest production years of U.S. fighters. And they still, were getting sent up against 60 109s or 190s or anything like that.
Oh
so.
my gosh, it's crazy. And then they flew interdiction missions during the Battle of the Bulge. Obviously, that's when Ken was shot down for the second time, and they flew their final mission against German forces on May 7th, 1945, at the captured Ansbach airfield in Germany. So the 353rd remained in occupied Germany as part of the occupying force and was stationed at our Army Airfield Station. Holy cow. I'm not even going to attempt to say it because it might come out bad. But I did see that it was referred to as Herzog. They call it the airport. So we'll call it Herzog. And they were officially inactivated on March 31st, 1946. However, the 353rd would be reactivated in November of 1956, flying F-100 Super Sabres. Kind of a fun... We didn't want to include it in the surviving warbird section, but if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably well aware of the very beautiful, in my humble opinion, F-100F that's currently... I don't know if it's still flying or not. But it's owned by Dean... please forgive me if this pronunciation... Cutshall, out of Indiana. The beautiful red and rainbow command markings. That F-100 is actually the markings of the 353rd Tactical Fighter Squadron. And interestingly, with the red or the rainbow command stripes, it is the wing commander of the 354th Tactical Fighter Wing, which at the time was commanded by another World War II ace, Colonel Francis Gabby Gabreski. So kind of a cool tie-in right there that really made me nerd out. But kind of a cool little callback to another famous ace. So the 353rd would briefly fly F-4Es at Torrejon Air Base in Spain in 1970 and 1971 before receiving A-70 Corsairs, and they flew them from Myrtle Beach Air Force Base in South Carolina. Their squadron actually was deployed to Southeast Asia, particularly Korat Royal Thai Air Force Base in Thailand in 1970-1971, and would fly missions in the final years of the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. So kind of cool tie-in there as well. They would later receive A-10 Thunderbolt IIs in 1978 and would fly them in combat in 1991 during the Gulf War. And then they, very shortly after, would lose the flying mission in December of 1992 following the end of the Cold War and the Gulf War. Not too long after, though, they were reactivated in 1993 as a non-flying squadron, as actually the 353rd Combat Training Squadron up in Alaska. And interestingly, for all you Air Force nerds like me, the 353rd is actually responsible for hosting and putting on the Red Flag Alaska exercise. So whenever you hear or see the photos from that, you can always somehow make the connection to Ken Dahlberg from now on.
There you go.
All right, so now into at least one of my favorite parts of the podcast, talking about the planes associated with Dahlberg. So, again, we kind of mentioned at the beginning of the episode that Ken was kind of a journeyman when it came to Squadron Mustangs. He also might have been called scrapper of a few.
A little bit, yeah.
A little bit. So, Sam, you want to talk about Beantown Banshee? That's a cool one.
Yeah, so one of the first aircraft that come up in, the Dahlberg research, you're going to see it is Beantown Banshee. That's 43-7163 is the tail code. Wasn't assigned to Dahlberg. None of these aircraft were. It was actually, forgive me, I don't remember the name. It was assigned to the squadron commander, actually, of the 353rd. He did score his second kill against an FW-190 while flying it.
Yep, on, I think, June 29th, 1944. And I don't recall if the fate of Beantown Banshee's ever been known. If I remember correctly, according to the Army Air Force or Army Air Corps in Europe, or that really good research website, I believe it crashed on landing, and it's unknown if it was ever repaired. Very similar fate to a lot of wartime Mustangs. Who knows? It could be buried out in some field near, some old Army Air Force station. Now, moving on to the second one.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, you're good.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, moving on to the second P-51, I would say this one, especially in recent years, has become very closely associated with Dahlberg, and that is the P-51B, the Shillelaugh. If you don't know what a Shillelaugh is, it's basically an Irish walking stick that, traditional Irish folklore, they look and, they're used for, helping people get around. So the name of it's kind of a fun nickname for a Mustang, but the tail number for that one was 42-106602. So quite a long tail number, especially for a Mustang. Again, this one was not Ken Dahlberg's. However, he did become an ace while flying it on August 16th, 1944. It arrived in England on March 22nd, 1944, and was assigned to the 9th Air Force of the 354th Fighter Group on April 13th, 1944. It was designated to belong to combat veteran David B. O'Hara, who flew with the 353rd. It crashed when Ken, I believe, he was flying it when he was shot down, correct? Yeah.
Yep. He was the scrapper of this one.
Yep. So this is the one, I think, crashed, and he was it the one where he was assisted with the French?
It was. Yep. Yeah. It was his first shoot down.
Yep. And crashed right into a field, and there was not a whole lot left of it. No. So instead of recovering all the parts, they were just buried. However, in the late 2010s, spearheaded by, I believe, the late Paul Elin, a lot of those parts were recovered and shipped right to our neck of the woods up at AirCorps Aviation in Bemidji. And it is currently undergoing restoration and a full rebuild, and hopefully we'll see the air sometime soon once again.
Yeah, and they have a really nice write-up on their site for it, so it's definitely check that out. We'll link it here in the podcast description too.
Absolutely. We have to give a quick shout out to AirCorps. Yeah. Without, especially going to give a quick shout out to Eric and our friend Brian. If it wasn't for them, especially, giving us, well, at least giving me a full tour. Fortunately, Sam couldn't be there for that. This episode wouldn't even have half the research that it has.
Right.
So, thank you to AirCorps Aviation for, being a part of this. We
really
appreciate
thanks.
it. So the third Mustang that is associated with Dahlberg is the P-51D Little Horse. The original tail number for it was 44-13551. I think he flew it on, I could find just one mission.
Yeah, that's all I could find.
It's a D model, so, doesn't have the Razorback, or the, what are they? I know the Razorback was more commonly associated with Thunderbolts. What was there a name for, like, the...
You could still call it a Razorback or Fastback.
Fastback, yeah, that's what I always heard.
I always call it a Fastback.
So, kind of again, Ken Dahlberg has a lot of cool stories associated with his Mustangs. But Little Horse, he flew on one mission, I actually believe in September of 1944. And that was really his only connection to it. However, when it was being restored, again, Paul Elin had this one restored and put in the markings of the plane that Ken flew. Very cool. The original crew chief was still alive.
Really?
And it was Staff Sergeant George Chaussee. He was the crew chief, and in my adopted hometown of Eden Prairie, Minnesota, the two of them met up in, I believe, 2007 and took pictures and had their first meeting in 61 years since the end of the war. Yeah. So they were able to reminisce over their time in combat. I should mention that it is not the original Little Horse. The fate of the original Little Horse is unknown, at least to me. And it was restored using a TP-51D serial number 45-11586 that had originally been delivered to the South Carolina Air National Guard. So kind of a cool connection there. And then the last aircraft that we associate with Ken Dahlberg is the P-47D number 42-29336 FTO. And we should mention this is the second FTO.
Yep.
This is a plane that Dahlberg was flying when he was hit by flak and was forcibly ejected from the aircraft, in which Ken survived and was eventually taken prisoner. I could not, unfortunately, find the tail number for the first FTO.
Yeah, me neither.
Kind of a bummer, but that information is probably on Joe Bauer's website somewhere. So now we come to the end. Warbirds today.
Where can you find them?
Yeah. So, as you know, we're in Fargo, North Dakota, and you don't have to go far to see Little Horse. 4 hours might be far for some people, but Little Horse is currently operated at Dakota Territory Air Museum in Minot, North Dakota, and like we had said earlier, it is actually the TP-51D 45-11586. And the chalet, Sam, if you want to talk about this, I feel like I've been talking a lot.
Oh, you're good, yeah. No, great contributions, Max. This is your
thank you.
tail numbers in squadron history.
I know,
is your bread and butter.
I'm like gripping the table over here. I love it so much.
Yeah. Yeah, so the Chalet 42-106602, it's currently undergoing that restoration and rebuild at AirCorps. We'll have to talk to Eric and the guys up there to see if we can check that out a little bit. But
That'd be
cool. Hopefully, we can get some updates on that. I know they're really good about pumping out updates on their sites.
Absolutely.
And this aircraft will eventually be at Dakota Territory Air Museum to add to their, 4 or 5 Mustangs? 5, yeah. So another Mustang and
2. No, it'll be 3 not D model Mustangs.
Yeah, because you got
Lopes Hope,
Thunderbird,
and Chalet. Now, obviously, we've mentioned him twice now, but the late Paul Elin, the Chalet restoration would not be where it is today if it wasn't for his efforts in recovering the wreck. So, just wanted to quick give him a honorable mention in this episode.
For sure.
Definitely missed in the Warbird community,
exactly.
for sure. So yeah, I think that kind of wraps up our Ken Dahlberg episode.
It's a lot of fun. A lot of fun to research, and
it's funny. I grew up in Eden Prairie, Minnesota, and Air Expo was always the thing that I got to look forward to every summer, and I always remember. Especially, I wish I had brought it, but I have my 2003 or 2004, shoot, it actually might be 2002, air show brochure. And, I flip through that every once in a while, and the names that are in that book are incredible. Like, you have World War I pilots, you have World War II pilots, Korea, Vietnam, all these incredible names. And one name that has always stuck out to me was Ken Dahlberg. Because a lot of the pilots they would bring in from, like Wisconsin or whatnot. But Ken Dahlberg was a Minnesota boy. Mm-hmm. At least maybe he was just born here, but I know he spent time in Wisconsin. But I always recognize that name. And, you can't talk about World War II or Minnesota-born fighter aces of World War II without talking about Ken Dahlberg.
Exactly.
So this one, like Sam said, this one was a lot of fun to research and...
Well, and I sat down with that book and I didn't get up. Easy book to kind of get through in a couple hours, but once I got into it, I went down a rabbit hole.
We should mention that book. I do not have it with me. You guys probably can't hear me, but
Max is off on a tangent over here, but
the book we referenced for most of the podcast episode was One Step Forward: The Life of Ken Dahlberg by Al Zadone and Warren Mack. Please forgive me if I pronounced that name wrong. But, it's not like a novel.
No. It's a good coffee table book, I would say.
It's a perfect coffee table book. But, it goes into such great detail about Ken's early life. There's his W form. Yeah, it's really fascinating. And what I like is, there's Chalet's wreckage. Yeah, there's not a whole lot left of that.
Yeah, it's just It's great for the casual reader, but also, there's no, inaccuracies or anything. It's very comprehensive, and
absolutely,
it does paint a really nice context to the war as well.
Agree.
And we've talked about that with other books that we've covered in this podcast. Talking about Emerson and some of the others, and it's they've all been really well rounded, and you get to kind of get on a personal level with each ace.
Mm-hmm.
And
this one does a perfect job.
Exactly.
It's very easy to read. Yeah.
And again, thanks to AirCorps for providing the books.
Yeah,
I mean, this
absolutely.
is super cool.
Yeah, Eric, if you're listening, thank you.
MVP
and
MVP
Ryan,
of the podcast, both of you. Yeah.
All right. Well, that about wraps it up for us. Sam.
Yeah.
Anything else?
No, we're excited. We're to be getting back into this again. I mean, this is our second one, and can't wait to get some more out for you guys.
Absolutely.
And this is a lot of fun. It's been a year since we've kind of been in the thick of it, so it's a lot bigger list to cover, but a very exciting list.
Absolutely. Well, thank you guys again for tuning in, and we will catch you on the next one.
Yep, thank you.
Take care.